The sound of the china plate shattering against my kitchen wall was the noise my heart made, sharp and final, scattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces. One moment I was holding it, warm from the microwave, filled with the meatloaf and scalloped potatoes I'd spent the afternoon making, and the next, it was a casualty of my daughter-in-law's rage, glistening bits of my dinner clinging to the pale yellow paint like grotesque confetti. "Who told you to sit here?" Emily had screamed, her voice a shard of glass itself. And in that frozen second, I saw my own son, David, flinch but say nothing, his eyes fixed on the tablecloth as if he could wish himself away. This wasn't the welcome I'd imagined. Not after driving 6 hours alone, my suitcase packed with a week's worth of hope and 2 new nightgowns. My heart a fragile, eager thing in my chest. I'd come to meet my first grandchild, a little boy named Samuel, who was sleeping upstairs, oblivious to the war breaking out over his very existence. I'd come to help, to be a grandmother, to finally feel like family again since my husband, Robert, had passed. But the moment I'd instinctively taken the chair at the head of the table, the one Robert had always occupied in our own home, Emily had snapped. It was just a chair, a piece of oak and upholstery, but in this new house, in this new life my son had built, it was a throne I was not permitted to touch. The silence that followed was heavier than the crash, thick and choking. David finally moved, a slow, pained unfolding from his own seat. "Emily, for God's sake," he whispered, the words sounding feeble, stripped of any real authority. He didn't look at me, his mother, who was sitting there with gravy slowly dripping down the wall behind her. He looked at his wife, whose chest was still heaving, her pretty face contorted into a mask of pure, undiluted hatred aimed directly at me. "She doesn't know the new rules," he added, and I thought, rules? Since when does a family dinner have rules about where a mother can sit? I looked from my son's defeated posture to Emily's triumphant glare, and in that moment, I wasn't just Martha, the 68-year-old widow from Ohio anymore. I was an intruder, a guest who had overstaying her welcome before she'd even taken her first bite. I'm so sorry, Emily," I managed, my voice trembling in a way that shamed me. "I didn't know. I'll sit over here." I gestured weakly to an empty chair along the side, a supplicant moving to a lower station. I began to stand, my knees protesting, feeling every one of my years and then some. But Emily wasn't finished. The storm hadn't passed. It had only gathered new strength. "No," she said, her voice dropping to a venomous calm. "You don't get to play the frail old lady card with me, Martha. I see you. I see exactly what you're doing. That wide-eyed, I'm just a harmless grandma routine might work on David, but it doesn't work on me. You come in here with your perfect meatloaf trying to show me up in my own kitchen, and then you just presume to take the head of the table like you're the matriarch here. This is my house, my family." Each word was a deliberate, precise blow. My meatloaf, a recipe from my own mother, was now a weapon. My simple, habitual gesture of sitting down was an act of aggression. I looked at David, my eyes pleading for him to step in, to defend me, to simply be my son. But he just stared at his hands, clenched into fists on the table. He was a ship caught in a hurricane, and he had chosen to batten down the hatches and ride it out, leaving me out in the storm. The betrayal was a physical coldness spreading through my veins. This was the little boy I'd read bedtime stories to, the young man I'd stayed up waiting for, the son whose hand I'd held at his father's funeral, and he was letting his wife eviscerate me over a dining chair. The fight went out of me then, not with a bang, but with a quiet, internal collapse. I sank back into the forbidden chair, not out of defiance, but out of a sheer inability to hold my own weight. "I think you should leave," Emily said, her voice flat and final. David's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. But still, he said nothing. Not a single word. The silence in the room was so profound, I could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, a sound that seemed to mock the chaos that had just erupted. David's eyes, wide with what I desperately wanted to believe was regret, met mine for a fleeting second before darting away again, as if the sight of me, his mother, sitting broken in that chair, was too much for him to bear. Emily stood her ground, arms crossed over her chest, her breathing still slightly ragged, her gaze fixed on me like I was a stain she needed to scrub clean. I felt the weight of every one of my 68 years pressing down on me, the ache in my bones a dull echo of the ache in my heart. "I think you should leave," she had said, and those words hung in the air, toxic and final. I looked at David, my son, the man I had raised to be kind, to be strong, to stand up for what was right, and I waited. I waited for him to say, "No, Mom, you don't have to go," or "Emily, that's enough," or anything at all that would stitch back together the fabric of our family that had just been torn apart. But he didn't. He just swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, and looked down at his hands again, as if they held the answers to how we had gotten here. So I did the only thing I could do. I pushed myself up from the chair, my legs trembling, and without a word I turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving the shattered plate and my shattered dignity behind me. The journey up the stairs to the guest room felt like climbing a mountain. Each step was heavy, laborious, and I held on to the banister for support, my vision blurring with unshed tears. I could hear the low, urgent murmur of their voices from below, Emily's sharp, insistent tones, David's softer, pleading responses, but I couldn't make out the words, and I didn't want to. Whatever they were saying, it was too late. The damage was done. I closed the door of the little room behind me, leaning against it for a moment, taking in the space that was supposed to be my sanctuary for the week. It was beautifully decorated, I'll give Emily that. Soft gray walls, a white quilt on the bed, a small vase of fresh flowers on the nightstand. It was a room meant for a guest, not a mother, and certainly not a grandmother who had just been exiled. I sank on the edge of the bed, the springs creaking softly under my weight, and let the tears come then. They were hot and silent, streaming down my face as I thought of Robert, of how he would have never stood for this. He would have taken one look at that situation and put his foot down, his voice a calm, steady force that could quiet any storm. But Robert was gone, and I was alone in a house that didn't want me. A soft cry from down the hall pulled me from my grief. Samuel, my grandson. I wiped my tears with the back of my hand, taking a shaky breath. That was why I was here. Not for Emily, not even for David, but for that little boy. I had held him just that afternoon, his small, warm body curled against mine, his tiny fingers grasping my thumb. He had my son's eyes, the same shade of blue that Robert had. And in that moment, I felt a connection so fierce it stole my breath. Now, hearing his cry, I felt a pull, a maternal instinct that transcended the pettiness downstairs. I stood up, smoothing my wrinkled slacks, and opened the door quietly. The hallway was dark, but a nightlight cast a soft glow from the nursery door, which was ajar. I peeked in, and there he was, in his crib, his little face scrunched up, arms flailing. Emily was nowhere in sight, probably still downstairs with David, and I felt a surge of something, protectiveness maybe, or desperation. I tiptoed into the room, the scent of baby powder and lavender calming my nerves. "Shh, little one," I whispered, reaching into the crib and lifting him gently. He felt so light in my arms, so trusting. I cradled him against my chest, rocking slowly back and forth, humming the same lullaby I used to sing to David. His cries softened into whimpers, then quieted altogether, his breath evening out against my neck. This This was what mattered. This tiny, innocent life. I held him for what felt like both an instant and an eternity, drinking in his warmth, his peace, until the sound of footsteps on the stairs made my heart leap into my throat. The door pushed open wider, and Emily stood there, her face illuminated by the hallway light. She didn't look angry anymore. She looked tired, and for a moment I saw the young woman I'd first met, the one who had smiled shyly at David and told me she loved my apple pie. But that glimpse vanished as her eyes narrowed at the sight of me holding her son. "What are you doing in here?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. "I heard him crying," I said, my own voice barely a whisper, afraid to disturb the baby. "I was just comforting him." She stepped forward, her arms outstretched. "I'll take him," she said. And it wasn't a request, it was a command. Reluctantly, I handed Samuel over, my arms feeling instantly empty and cold. She held him close, her body language possessive, a barrier between him and me. "You shouldn't be in here," she said, not looking at me. "I'm her grandmother," I replied, and the words sounded feeble, a title that clearly held no weight in this house. She turned to leave, but then paused at the door, glancing back at me. "We need to talk in the morning. About you leaving." And with that, she was gone, closing the door behind her, leaving me alone in the nursery with only the ghost of my grandson's warmth and the crushing weight of her words. I stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door, wondering how something as simple as a visit had turned into this. The memory of David's silence downstairs haunted me, a betrayal that cut deeper than any plate ever could. I knew then that this wasn't just about a chair. It was about something else, something darker that I had been blind to. And as I finally left the nursery and returned to my room, I made a decision. I wouldn't leave without a fight, not for my sake, but for Samuel's. He deserved to know his grandmother, and I deserved to know him. But first, I needed to understand what was really going on in my son's house, and why the woman he loved seemed to hate me so much. The night stretched out before me, long and sleepless, filled with questions and the aching loneliness of a mother who had lost her son in a way she never expected. The first light of dawn was a pale, reluctant gray through the window, and I hadn't slept a wink. The quilt was a tangled mess around me, a testament to the restlessness that had plagued me all night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the plate shattering, the grotesque pattern of gravy on the wall, the look on David's face. A look of such profound helplessness, it made my stomach clench. But more than that, I replayed the feel of Samuel in my arms, the solid, breathing reality of him, the way his tiny hand had fisted in the collar of my blouse as if he were holding on for dear life. I couldn't just leave. I wouldn't. I got up, my body stiff and protesting, and dressed quietly in the half-light. The house was silent, a heavy, waiting silence. I crept downstairs, avoiding the third step from the top that I knew creaked, my senses hyper-aware. The dining room was clean, immaculate, in fact. The broken plate was gone, the wall wiped spotless, the tablecloth replaced. It was as if the eruption of the night before had never happened, and that somehow felt more sinister than if the debris had been left there as a monument to her anger. I moved into the kitchen, my sanctuary in my own home for over 40 years, but here it felt like foreign territory. Everything was sleek and stainless steel, cold to the touch. There were no well-worn wooden spoons, no chipped ceramic canisters, no comforting clutter. It was a kitchen for show, not for living. I filled the expensive-looking kettle, my hands trembling slightly, and set it on the stove, the click of the igniter sounding like a gunshot in the quiet. I was searching for a tea bag, my mind a whirl of what I would say, how I would stand my ground, when I heard a soft footfall behind me. I turned, expecting Emily, my spine instinctively straightening for a fight, but it was David. He looked terrible, shadows pooling under his eyes, his hair a mess. He was still in his pajamas, and he looked like the little boy who used to climb into my bed after a nightmare. Mom, I'm so sorry about last night. He didn't come closer, just stood in the doorway, a ghost in his own home. The apology should have been a balm, but it felt like another weight. It was too little, too late, and we both knew it. What was that, David? I asked, keeping my voice low but firm. I crossed my arms over my chest, not to be confrontational, but to hold myself together. What in God's name was that? Since when does a mother need permission to sit at a table in her son's house? He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, his gaze dropping to the spotless floor. It's not that simple, Mom. Then explain it to me, I pleaded, the desperation I'd been holding back seeping into my words. Make me understand, because from where I'm standing, your wife threw a plate at the wall because I sat in the wrong chair, and you sat there and said nothing. Nothing, David. My voice broke on his name, and I saw him flinch. It's her house, Mom. She has ways she likes things. It was a pathetic excuse, and the look on his face told me he knew it. Ways? I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping me. David, that wasn't about ways. That was about hatred, pure and simple. What have I ever done to her to deserve that? I've always tried to be kind, to give her space. I bought them this house for heaven's sake. It was a card I never wanted to play, a fact I had kept tucked away because generosity shouldn't come with strings. But the words were out now, hanging between us. The down payment for this beautiful, cold house had come from the life insurance money after Robert died, a final gift from a father who wanted to see his son settled. His head snapped up, his eyes flashing with a pain I didn't understand. Don't, Mom. Please don't bring that up. That just makes it worse. He looked over his shoulder, up the stairs, a nervous tick I recognized from his teenage years when he was hiding something. You don't get it. There's stuff you don't know. Before I could ask what he meant, what terrible secret could possibly justify such behavior, the sound of a crying baby filtered down the stairs. It was Samuel. David's posture changed instantly. The guilty son vanished, replaced by an anxious father. I have to go, he muttered, and he turned and hurried away, leaving me alone in the sterile kitchen with the whistling kettle and a fresh, gnawing fear. What didn't I know? What stuff was festering in his beautiful, terrible house, poisoning my son against me, turning his wife into a vindictive stranger? The mystery was a cold knot in my stomach, tighter and more frightening than the anger of the night before. I wasn't just fighting for a relationship with my grandson anymore. I was suddenly fighting against a shadow, an unknown enemy that had my son in its grip. I poured the boiling water into a mug, the steam clouding my vision, and resolved that I would find out what it was, no matter the cost. The whistle of the kettle faded into a hollow hiss, mirroring the air leaving my lungs. Stuff I didn't know. The words echoed in the silent, sterile kitchen, taking on a sinister shape. What could be so terrible that it would make my own son look at me with that mixture of pity and fear? I carried my untouched tea to the small breakfast nook, my hands shaking so badly the liquid sloshed over the rim, scalding my skin. I barely felt it. All I could feel was a cold, creeping dread. This wasn't just a clash of personalities. This was a chasm, and David was standing on the other side, refusing to throw me a rope. I heard the soft sounds of movement upstairs, David's low murmur, Emily's sharper tone, the gentle creak of the floorboards as they tended to Samuel. They were a unit, a family, and I was the outsider, the disruptive element. The generous check I'd written for this house's down payment felt like a lie now, not a gift of love, but a transaction that had somehow indebted my son in a way I couldn't comprehend. An hour passed, the sun growing stronger, painting bright, accusing rectangles on the flawless floor. I was still sitting there, my tea cooled in the cup, when David came back down. He was dressed now, in jeans and a button-down shirt, but he looked no more comfortable, no more at home in his own skin. He didn't look at me as he went to the fancy coffee machine, pressing buttons with a tense practice efficiency. The machine grumbled and hissed, filling the room with the rich aroma that suddenly felt cloying. "She's taking Samuel to a mom and baby group," he said finally, his back to me. "She'll be gone for a few hours." It was an offering, a fragile truce, a chance for us to talk without her in the house. "David, look at me," I said, my voice softer now, stripped of the earlier anger, leaving only a raw plea. He turned slowly, the steam from his coffee cup wreathing his troubled face. "Please, just tell me, what is going on? What is this really about? Because it can't be about a chair." I saw the war in his eyes, the desperate need to unburden himself, wrestling with a fear I still didn't understand. He walked over and sat down opposite me, the table a vast, polished expanse between us. It's about everything, Mom," he began, his voice low and rushed, as if he feared being overheard. "It's about every time you called when we were first dating and I had to cut our conversation short. It's about the way you looked at her wedding dress and said it was very modern. It's about the meatloaf you made last night, which you know is my favorite, and how you said, 'I remember how much you love this,' right in front of her." I stared at him, utterly bewildered. These were insignificant moments, tiny blips in the timeline of our lives, long forgotten by me. But to him, to Emily, they were apparently evidence in some terrible, ongoing trial. "David, that's insanity," I whispered, my heart breaking for the both of us. "I was happy for you. I thought her dress was beautiful. I was being nostalgic with the meatloaf. I was trying to connect." He wouldn't meet my gaze, staring into his black coffee as if it were a scrying pool. "To her, it's not connection. It's competition. It's criticism. Every little thing is a reminder that she'll never be you." The statement was so absurd, so devastatingly wrong, that I actually laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Never be me? David, I'm a widow living alone in a 3-bedroom house full of memories. She's a young mother in a beautiful new home with a husband who adores her and a healthy baby boy. Why on earth would she want to be me?" He finally looked up, and his eyes were filled with a torment so deep it stole my breath. "Because of me," he said, the words barely audible. "Because she knows, that a part of me will always belong to you first." And there it was, the rotten core of it, not a hidden secret about money or a past misdeed, but this, a terrible, consuming jealousy of the love a son has for his mother. I felt the fight drain out of me, replaced by a profound, weary sadness. How do you battle a ghost? How do you reason with a love that has curdled into possession? Before I could form a response, the sound of the garage door opening made us both jump. Emily was back early. David's face paled, and he stood up so quickly his knee hit the table, sloshing his coffee. The moment of fragile confession was over, shattered by the sound of a car engine. He looked at me, a silent, desperate plea in his eyes. "Don't say anything, please," before he hurried to the sink to wipe up the spill. I sat there frozen as Emily walked in, Samuel bundled in her arms. She took in the scene, David's nervous cleaning, my stricken face, and her eyes hardened. She didn't say a word to either of us. She just walked past, her posture rigid, and carried my grandson up the stairs, leaving a chill in her wake that had nothing to do with the morning air. The conversation was over, but the war had just found its true battlefield. And I was now certain the real enemy wasn't Emily's anger, but my own son's devastating, divided heart. The chill Emily left in her wake seemed to seep into the very walls, and the house felt quieter than ever, a museum of unspoken grievances. David finished wiping the counter with a frantic, jerky motion, unable to look at me. The coffee stain was gone, but the mark of his confession remained, a dark, spreading blot on both our hearts. "She must have forgotten something," he muttered, a weak explanation for her abrupt return. But we both knew. She had sensed the shift in the atmosphere, the crack in her carefully controlled universe, where a moment of truth had leaked through. I could still hear his words. "A part of me will always belong to you first," echoing in the silence. They should have been a comfort, a testament to a bond I thought was unbreakable. Instead, they felt like a death sentence for any hope of a peaceful family. I stood up, my legs feeling ancient, and carried my cold tea to the sink. I stood beside my son, not touching him, both of us staring out the window at the perfectly manicured but utterly soulless backyard. "David," I said, my voice quiet but clear, no longer pleading, "that isn't love. What she's doing to you, to us, that's not love. It's control." He flinched as if I'd struck him. "You don't understand our relationship," he said, his voice tight, a rehearsed line he'd clearly told himself 100 times. "She's under a lot of pressure. With the baby, with her job, she needs things to be a certain way to feel secure." "And do you?" I asked, turning to look at his profile, at the tension in his jaw. "Do you need things to be this way? Walking on eggshells in your own home, letting your mother be treated like a stranger so your wife can feel secure?" It was the hardest question I'd ever asked him, because I was truly afraid of the answer. He closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. "It's just easier," he whispered, a confession more damning than any other. "It's just easier to give her what she wants." The simplicity of his surrender shattered what was left of my composure. He wasn't a hostage in some dramatic standoff. He was a volunteer in his own captivity, because the peace of surrender was preferable to the war of standing up for what was right. The back door opened suddenly, and we both jumped. It was just the gardener, here for his weekly maintenance, but the intrusion felt like a violation. David used the distraction to flee, mumbling something about needing to check his email, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the roaring silence and the profound understanding that my son had chosen the path of least resistance, and that path led directly away from me. I spent the rest of the morning in a haze, tidying the already spotless guest room, the motions pointless. I could hear Emily moving around upstairs, her footsteps firm and purposeful. I needed air to escape the suffocating perfection of this house. I slipped out the front door, onto the pristine porch, and sat on a stiff, modern rocking chair that offered no comfort. I pulled out my phone, my finger hovering over my sister Carol's name. I needed to hear a friendly voice, someone who would tell me I wasn't crazy, that this situation was as monstrous as it felt. But I couldn't press call. What would I say? My daughter-in-law hates me, and my son is letting her? It felt too pathetic, too humiliating to give voice to. So I just sat, watching the leaves in the quiet, upscale neighborhood begin to turn, their brilliant reds and golds a stark contrast to the gray emptiness inside me. I didn't know how to fight an enemy who had already won the only battle that mattered, the heart of my child. I was still sitting there, lost in a past where my son would have fought dragons for me, when the front door opened and Emily stepped out. She was holding Samuel, bundled in a little blue jacket, and she was smiling. It wasn't a smile for me. It was a performance. "We're going for a walk," she announced, her voice sickeningly sweet. "Would you like to join us, Martha?" The invitation was a trap. I knew it in my bones. But Samuel looked at me with his big blue eyes, and my heart, foolish and hopeful, leapt at the chance. This was my opening, a tiny crack in the fortress wall. I nodded, my throat too tight for words. "I'd like that," I managed. And as I fell into step beside her, the three of us, a picturesque tableau of a grandmother, mother, and child on a beautiful autumn day, I felt the weight of her expectation. I was to play my part, the harmless, grateful old lady put neatly back in her box. But the memory of the shattered plate and the sound of my son's surrender were fresh in my mind, and I knew, with a terrifying clarity, that this walk was just another battlefield. The autumn air was crisp and carried the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves, a smell that usually filled me with a sense of cozy nostalgia. But today, it felt thin and sharp in my lungs. We walked in a stilted procession, Emily a few purposeful steps ahead, me trailing slightly behind, like a dinghy tied to a steamship. Samuel, nestled in his expensive stroller, was the silent, oblivious center of our universe. Emily maintained a steady stream of chirpy commentary directed at the baby, her voice a bright, artificial shield against any possibility of real conversation with me. "Look, Sammy, a red leaf, so pretty. And see the squirrel? He's gathering nuts for winter." Each word was a brick she was laying in the wall between us. I tried to interject, to connect. "Your father loved chasing squirrels when he was little," I said, my voice sounding timid against her performative cheer. "He once tried to bring one home in his jacket." Emily didn't even turn her head. "I'm sure," she said, the words clipped and cold. Then to Samuel, "But we know not to touch wild animals, don't we, sweetie? They're dirty." The rebuke was so subtle, so expertly delivered, it was like being cut with a razor. She was erasing David's childhood, my memories, and rewriting the narrative with her own sterile rules. My anecdote wasn't a sweet story, it was a lesson in poor hygiene. We reached a small park, a manicured patch of green with a bright plastic playground. Emily parked the stroller and lifted Samuel out, holding him on her hip as she swayed gently. She finally turned to me, her smile still firmly in place, but it didn't reach her eyes. They were flat and assessing. "He needs to experience the textures," she stated, as if reading from a parenting manual. She sat on a bench, placing Samuel on the blanket of grass in front of her, well away from any other children. I moved to sit beside her, my heart hammering against my ribs. "This is a lovely neighborhood," I tried again, grasping for neutral ground. "So quiet, perfect for raising a family." "It is," she agreed, her gaze fixed on Samuel as he clumsily patted the grass. "We chose it very carefully. We wanted a fresh start, a clean slate." She emphasized the last two words, and I felt their weight. A clean slate, one that had no room for the messy, emotional scribbles of a past that included me. We lapsed into another silence, this one even more oppressive than the one in the kitchen. I watched Samuel, his little face a perfect, innocent blend of David and Emily, and my love for him felt like a physical ache, a desperate, clawing thing. I wanted to scoop him up, to breathe in his baby scent, to feel that profound connection again. I started to lean forward, my hand outstretched, to point out a ladybug crawling near his foot. "Don't," Emily said, her voice low but laced with steel. I froze. She didn't look at me, her attention still on Samuel. "He's exploring his sensory environment. Your interference will disrupt his focus." My hand hovered in the air, useless, then fell back into my lap. Interference. That's all I was. An interruption in their perfect, controlled world. The sun was warm on my face, children were laughing on the swings, but I had never felt so cold or so alone. This walk wasn't an olive branch. It was a demonstration. It was Emily showing me in a dozen subtle, cruel ways exactly what my role was to be. A spectator, silent and distant, admiring her masterpiece from afar, but never, ever touching the paint. The hope I'd felt on the porch shriveled and died, replaced by a grim determination. I couldn't win her over. I couldn't reason with David. but I would not be erased from my grandson's life. As we stood to leave, Samuel began to fuss, reaching a tiny hand not toward his mother, but toward a bright yellow leaf tumbling past. In that instant, I saw it, a spark of curiosity, of will that was all his own. And I knew, with every fiber of my being, that I had to protect that spark from the sterile, controlled world Emily was building around him. The war was no longer about a chair, or a meatloaf, or even my son's betrayal. It was for Samuel's soul. The yellow leaf tumbled away, and Samuel's fussing escalated into a full-throated cry, a sound of pure, frustrated desire that seemed to echo my own inner screaming. Emily swooped him up instantly, her movement practiced and efficient, shushing him against her shoulder. "It's nap time," she declared, her voice leaving no room for argument, and without a backward glance, she began pushing the stroller back toward the house, the perfectly aligned wheels a silent testament to her need for order. I followed, my feet like lead, the brief glimpse of Samuel's budding independence already feeling like a memory I had to cherish and protect. The walk back was silent, the earlier pretense of a pleasant outing completely abandoned. The house loomed before us, not a home, but a fortress I was temporarily permitted to enter. Back inside, the air was still and cold. Emily took Samuel upstairs, and I was left alone in the living room, adrift in a sea of beige upholstery and minimalist art that held no warmth, no history. The silence was a physical presence, and it pressed in on me heavy with all the things left unsaid. I needed to do something, anything, to feel useful, to feel like I wasn't just a ghost haunting the edges of their lives. I remembered the laundry. It was a small domestic task, but it was something. I moved quietly to the small laundry room off the kitchen, a space as sleek and impersonal as the rest of the house. I opened the dryer, the warm, fragrant air a small comfort. I began folding David's t-shirts, the soft, worn cotton familiar under my fingers. This, at least, was a thread connecting me to my son, a mundane act of love I had performed 1,000 times before. It was while I was reaching for a small, tiny onesie belonging to Samuel that my hand brushed against something stiff and papery tucked beneath the rest of the clothes. It was a photograph. My breath caught in my throat. It was an old picture, slightly faded at the edges, clearly having been looked at many times. It was a woman I had never seen before, with dark, curling hair and a wide, generous smile. Her arms wrapped around a young man who was unmistakably David. He looked younger, maybe in his early 20s, his face lit with a joy so raw and unguarded it made my heart ache. It was a look I hadn't seen on him in years. This wasn't a casual snapshot. It was a photograph of profound intimacy, of two people deeply, hopelessly in love. And tucked into the bottom corner of the picture, written in my son's familiar handwriting, were 2 words: "My Elena." I stared at the image, my mind reeling. Who was this woman? Why did David have a photo of her hidden in the laundry of all places? The pieces began to click into place with a terrifying, dreadful clarity. Emily's searing insecurity, her belief that she would never measure up, her need to eradicate my influence. It wasn't just about me. It was about a ghost. It was about this smiling, vibrant woman named Elena, whose memory clearly still held a piece of my son's heart that Emily could never touch. The photo in my hand felt like a live wire, buzzing with dangerous truth. This was the stuff David couldn't tell me. This was the shadow I was fighting. I was so lost in the shocking discovery that I didn't hear Emily come down the stairs. I only looked up when I felt her presence in the doorway, a cold wave preceding her. Her eyes went from my face to the photograph in my hand, and the color drained from her own. The mask of cold composure she always wore shattered completely, replaced by a look of pure, undiluted horror. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a violence that terrified me more than her screaming ever had. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. The photograph felt like it was burning my fingers. Emily's face was a terrifying blank canvas for a second, before it crumbled into a mask of such raw, gut-wrenching pain that I instinctively took a step back. This wasn't the anger of a controlling woman. This was the agony of a deeply wounded one. It was in the laundry, I stammered, my voice weak, an utterly inadequate response to the devastation in her eyes. She crossed the room in 2 swift strides and snatched the picture from my hand, her fingers trembling so violently I thought the paper would tear. "You have no right," she choked out, her voice thick with tears she was desperately fighting. "No right to go through our things, no right to see this." She clutched the photo to her chest, as if protecting a wound. The name echoed in the space between us. Elena. The mystery woman with the luminous smile, the one who had owned a piece of my son's heart I never knew existed. "Emily, who is she?" I asked, my voice soft. All my own hurt and confusion momentarily set aside in the face of her palpable grief. A bitter, broken sound that was almost a laugh escaped her. "Who is she? She's the reason I can never win. She's the ghost in every room, the standard I can never live up to." Her eyes, glistening with unshed tears, met mine, and for the first time, I saw not a monster, but a mirror of my own profound loss. "He loved her," she whispered, the words tearing from her throat. "He was going to marry her, and then she died. A car accident, 2 weeks before their wedding." The air left my lungs. I felt the world tilt. He was going to marry her. My son had endured a loss of that magnitude, and I had never known. He had never told me. The knowledge was a physical blow, a sucker punch to my very soul. All those years, his quiet withdrawal, his reluctance to commit, his almost desperate attachment to Emily when they first started dating, it all made a horrifying, tragic sense. He wasn't just my son, he was a man carrying a ghost. "He never told me," I breathed, the words filled with a hurt so deep it felt ancestral. "He never said a word." "Of course he didn't," Emily shot back, her momentary vulnerability hardening back into defensive armor. "You were the perfect family, the perfect mother with your perfect son. How could he tell you his perfect life had fallen apart? He couldn't bear the disappointment." The accusation hung in the air, absurd and heartbreaking. Did he really think his grief would be a disappointment to me? The thought was its own unique agony. "I'm his mother," I said, my own tears starting to fall now. "I would have held him. I would have grieved with him." "But you didn't, did you?" she said, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. "I did. I was the one who held him while he cried for her. I was the one who pieced him back together. I gave him a home, a family, a future. And yet," her gaze dropped to the photograph still clenched in her fist, "and yet I found this, not in an old box, in his sock drawer. He still looks at it. So you see, Martha, it doesn't matter how many meatloaves you make or how many chairs you sit in. I am fighting a battle against a memory. And a memory is perfect. A memory can never throw a plate or criticize a wedding dress or try to steal a son's love. I will always be the flawed, living replacement for the saint who died." The truth of her words, the brutal, unfair reality of it, settled over me. Her hatred for me wasn't just about me. It was about everything I represented. A past he cherished, a love that came before her, a bond she could never sever. She saw my every word, my every gesture as a reminder that she was his second choice. The door upstairs creaked open, and David's voice called down, "Em, everything okay?" The sound broke the intense spell between us. Emily swiftly wiped her eyes, her back straightening, the mask of composed hostility slamming back into place. She shoved the crumpled photograph into the pocket of her jeans. "We're done here," she said to me, her voice cold and final. "This conversation never happened, and you will be on your way back to Ohio tomorrow." She turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the laundry room with the scent of fabric softener and the devastating knowledge that my son's heart had been broken long before mine ever was, and I had been too blind to see it. The truth was a lead weight in my stomach, so heavy I could barely stand. I heard Emily's footsteps recede upstairs, her voice a muffled, reassuring lie to David. "Everything's fine, just showing your mom where the extra towels are." The mundane cover story was a grotesque contrast to the seismic shift that had just occurred. I leaned against the cold stainless steel of the dryer, the hum of its motor a dull vibration that did nothing to quiet the roar in my mind. Elena, a name I never knew, a grief I never shared, a chasm in my son's life I had been oblivious to. He was going to be married. He had lost the love of his life, and he had carried that burden alone, or perhaps only with Emily, while I remained in my cozy Ohio home, picturing a son who was simply taking his time settling down. The memory of his withdrawn behavior after college, the year he spent traveling aimlessly, the way he'd sometimes get a distant, hollow look in his eyes, it all rearranged itself into a new, heartbreaking pattern. I hadn't been blind, I'd been shut out. And the reason, according to Emily, was that he couldn't bear to disappoint me. The idea was so profoundly wrong, it made me feel ill. Was my love so conditional that he thought his tragic loss would be a mark against him? I finally pushed myself away from the dryer and wandered back into the living room, collapsing into an armchair that seemed to swallow me whole. The photograph of Elena's smiling face was burned into my retina. She was beautiful, her joy so palpable it seemed to leap from the memory of the paper. How could anyone compete with a ghost, with a love frozen in perfection by tragedy? For the first time, I felt a flicker of something other than fear and anger toward Emily. It was a dreadful, complicated pity. She had built her life on the ruins of his, and she lived every day knowing she inhabited a space that belonged to a ghost. Her cruelty wasn't just born of jealousy, it was born of a desperate, failing insecurity. The plate smashing against the wall wasn't just aimed at me, it was aimed at the entire past, at a history she could not control or erase. I sat there as the afternoon light began to fade, painting long, melancholy shadows across the floor. I heard David come down, his footsteps hesitant. He paused in the doorway, watching me. I didn't look up. "Mom?" he said, his voice tentative. "Emily said you're leaving tomorrow." It wasn't a question, it was a confirmation of my sentence. I finally lifted my head to look at him. Really look at him. This man who was my son, and yet a stranger who had hidden a universe of pain from me. "Why didn't you tell me, David?" The question came out as a whisper, stripped of all accusation, filled only with a bottomless sorrow. His face, which had been carefully arranged into a neutral expression, crumbled. He knew instantly what I was talking about. The secret was out. He walked slowly into the room and sank onto the sofa opposite me, his head falling into his hands. "I couldn't," he mumbled into his palms. "How do you tell your mom that the life she imagined for you, it all just blew up? It was easier to just let you think I was happy." "Easier for who?" I asked, the pain sharp in my voice. "For you? For me? David, I am your mother. My job isn't to only share your joy. It's to hold your hand through the pain. All of it." I thought of Robert, of how we had leaned on each other through every loss, every setback. That was what family was. I loved Elena, he said, his voice cracking on her name, a sound so full of fresh anguish, it was clear the wound had never healed. She was everything. And then she was gone. And when I met Emily, it was different. It was safe. She was strong where I was broken. She built this. He gestured around the perfect, cold room. She gave me Samuel. But she knows, Mom. She knows she lives in a shadow. And you are the living, breathing reminder of the life I had before that shadow fell. Every time you smile at me, she sees me as that young man who belonged to someone else. The confession hung in the dimming light, a tragic explanation for an impossible situation. He was trapped between honoring a ghost and appeasing the woman who had given him a future. And I, his mother, had become the symbol of the past he was supposed to have left behind. My heart broke for all of us. For David, forever grieving, for Emily, forever feeling second best, and for myself, forever on the outside of a pain I should have been allowed to share. The front door opened and closed. Emily had taken Samuel out again, giving us this space, or perhaps unable to be in the same house with the truth now that it was out. David looked at me, his eyes pleading for understanding, for forgiveness. But I didn't know what to forgive anymore. The person I was most angry with in that moment wasn't him or even Emily. It was the cruel twist of fate that had shattered one family to create this broken, miserable one. The truth settled between us not as a bridge, but as a vast, uncrossable lake, its waters dark and deep with sorrows I had never been allowed to share. David sat on the sofa, his shoulders slumped under the weight of a grief he'd carried alone for years, and I remained in the chair, my own heart aching with a fresh maternal pain for a wound I'd never been permitted to soothe. The tidy, silent house felt like a tomb for the living, burying us all in secrets and regrets. "She gave me a reason to keep going," David finally said, his voice hollow. "After Elena, I was nothing. Emily was strong. She took charge. She built this life for us, and I was just grateful." I understood then that his silence, his acquiescence to her every demand, wasn't just about avoiding conflict. It was a form of payment, a debt of gratitude for a life she had constructed from the ashes of his own. I didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry" felt inadequate for a loss of that magnitude. "Why didn't you trust me?" felt like an accusation he couldn't bear. So I just sat in the gathering dusk, the silence now a shared burden instead of a hostile one. When I heard the car pull back into the garage, a new kind of tension entered the room. David quickly wiped his eyes, straightening his posture, the mask of the obedient husband slipping back into place. It was heartbreaking to watch. Emily came in, Samuel asleep in his car seat carrier. She didn't look at me. Her eyes went directly to David, scanning him, assessing the damage. "I put his bag in your car," she said to me, her tone flat. Final. "You should get an early start tomorrow. The traffic can be bad." There was no discussion, no pretense. My banishment was confirmed. I just nodded. What else was there to do? I stood, my joints protesting, and went upstairs to the guest room. The suitcase I had packed with so much hope 2 days ago now felt like a coffin for my dreams of being a grandmother. I finished zipping it closed, my hands moving slowly, mechanically. I looked around the perfectly appointed room, at the vase of flowers that had already begun to wilt, and I knew I would never sleep here again. The rest of the evening passed in a surreal, funereal quiet. We ate a silent, pre-prepared meal Emily had heated in the microwave. No one offered to cook, no one mentioned my meatloaf. I helped clear the plates, my movements careful, trying to be invisible. Later, as I prepared for bed, I heard the soft sounds of David giving Samuel his bedtime bottle downstairs, and the ache in my chest was so profound it was a physical pain. I was being exiled from his life, from my grandson's life, over a grief I never knew existed. The next morning, I was awake before dawn. I dressed in the dark, my suitcase standing by the door like a sentinel of failure. I couldn't leave without one more look. I crept down the hall to the nursery. The door was ajar. In the soft glow of the nightlight, I could see Samuel sleeping peacefully in his crib, his chest rising and falling in a gentle rhythm. He was so perfectly, innocently himself, untouched by the complicated and wounded history of the adults who loved him. My eyes filled with tears. I wanted to memorize the curve of his cheek, the shape of his tiny hand splayed on the mattress. I didn't dare go in. I just stood there, a ghost at the doorway, saying a silent, aching goodbye. A floorboard creaked behind me. I turned, expecting Emily, ready for a final bitter send-off. But it was David. He looked as exhausted as I felt. He didn't speak. He just walked to me and wrapped his arms around me in a tight, desperate hug. It was the first time he had truly touched me since I arrived. I held him, my son, feeling the tremors that ran through his frame, and I understood. This was his apology, his confession, and his goodbye, all wordlessly conveyed in that one crushing embrace. Then he let go, his eyes glistening, and turned away, disappearing back into the shadows of the hallway. I picked up my suitcase, walked down the stairs, and let myself out into the cold, gray light of a morning I had never wanted to see. As I pulled my car out of the driveway, I took one last look in the rearview mirror at the beautiful, terrible house that held my son, my grandson, and a ghost named Elena. I had lost. But as I drove toward the highway, a new, stubborn seed of determination began to sprout through the devastation. This couldn't be the end. Not like this. The story was too broken, the wounds too deep. I had to find a way back. Not for me, but for all of us. The highway stretched before me, a gray river of concrete carrying me away from the wreckage of my family. For the first hour, I drove in a numb silence. The only sound, the hum of the tires, and the ragged echo of my own breathing. The image of Samuel sleeping in his crib was seared behind my eyelids, a tiny beacon of light in the overwhelming darkness. And then there was David's hug, that desperate, wordless, heartbreaking embrace that felt less like a goodbye and more like a cry for help from the bottom of a well. I replayed Emily's confession over and over, the raw pain in her voice as she spoke of competing with a ghost. I thought of the photograph, of Elena's vibrant, frozen smile. My anger toward Emily, which had felt so righteous and solid, had now crumbled into a complicated heap of pity and a dreadful understanding. She wasn't a villain. She was a prisoner too, locked in a cage of her own making, the bars forged from my son's unhealed heart. I found myself taking an exit I hadn't planned to, pulling into the parking lot of a rest stop that overlooked a barren field. I needed to stop. I needed to think. I turned off the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. I rested my forehead on the steering wheel, and the tears I had been holding back since leaving the house finally came, not in sobs, but in a quiet, relentless stream that soaked the knees of my slacks. I wasn't just crying for the lost visit, or for the cruel words, or even for the shattered plate. I was crying for the years of silence. I was crying for the son who felt he couldn't come to me with his greatest sorrow. I was crying for the grandson I might only see in carefully supervised, tense photographs. And yes, I was crying for the young woman I never knew, whose life was cut short and whose death had sent ripples of misery through so many lives, including my own. A truck rumbled past, shaking my car, and the reality of my situation snapped into sharp, clear focus. I couldn't go back to my empty house in Ohio and simply live with this. I couldn't let this be the end of our story. David was lost, but he wasn't gone. That hug proved it. Emily was drowning in her own insecurity, but she loved my son and her child. And Samuel? Samuel deserved more than to be raised in the mausoleum of secrets and resentments. I wiped my face with a tissue from my purse, my hands finally steady. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in my chest, but it was now surrounded by a firm, unyielding resolve. I had to find a way to bridge this impossible gap. But how? A confrontation would only make Emily dig her heels in deeper. Pleading with David would only increase his guilt and paralysis. They needed to see what they were doing, not just to me, but to themselves and to their son. They needed a mirror held up to their brokenness. And I, the person they had both pushed away, was perhaps the only one who could hold it. I didn't have a plan, not yet, but I had a direction. I started the car, but instead of continuing east toward Ohio, I turned around and drove back toward the town I had just left. I wasn't going to storm the castle. I was going to find a way to peacefully, patiently besiege it with a love that refused to be extinguished. I checked into a modest hotel on the outskirts of their town, a place with thin walls and stale coffee, a world away from their pristine neighborhood. I unpacked my suitcase, the same one I had packed with hope days before, and I knew I was staying. I wouldn't knock on their door. Not today. But I was here, and I would wait for my moment, for any tiny crack in the fortress wall, because love isn't always a warm meal and a smiling face. Sometimes it's a stubborn, quiet presence in the cold, waiting for a chance to mend what is broken. I took out my phone and sent a single text to David. I'm safely on the road. I love you. Tell Samuel his grandma loves him. It was the truth, but not the whole truth. I was on road, all right, but it was a road that had just curved dramatically, leading me not home, but to the front lines of the most important battle of my life. I sat on the edge of the stiff hotel bed, the floral bedspread scratchy under my hands, and I planned my siege. It would be a war of quiet patience, of subtle reminders, and unwavering love. I would become a part of the landscape of their town, a gentle, persistent fact they would have to eventually acknowledge. I thought of the small silver rattle I had bought for Samuel, still tucked in my suitcase. I wouldn't give it to him through Emily. I would find a way to give it to David, for him to give to his son. It was a start. A tiny, almost insignificant start. But as I looked out the hotel window at the unfamiliar streets, I felt a flicker of the first real hope I'd felt in days. The war was far from over, but I was no longer retreating. I was digging in. The floral hotel bedspread was scratchy against my skin, a far cry from the soft, expensive linens in Emily's guest room, but in a strange way, its rough honesty was a comfort. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. I lay there in the semi-darkness, the glow from the parking lot sign casting long, skeletal shadows across the ceiling, and I mapped out my campaign. A direct assault was out of the question. I couldn't phone David and demand to see him. That would only put him in the crossfire and give Emily more ammunition. I couldn't send a long, emotional letter pouring out my heart. It would be intercepted, dismissed as manipulation. No, this had to be different. This had to be a quiet, persistent demonstration of love, a presence so steady and undemanding that it would eventually force them to see me not as a threat, but as a fact of life, as unchangeable as the seasons. The next morning, I drove to a local real estate office and inquired about short-term rentals. I used the story of being a writer needing a quiet place to work for a few months, which wasn't entirely a lie. I was, in a way, trying to rewrite the story of my family. I found a small, furnished cottage on the other side of town, a quaint little place with a view of the mountains and a garden that had been let go wild. It was perfect. It had soul. I signed a 3-month lease, the act feeling both terrifying and exhilarating. This was no longer a reaction. It was a proclamation. I was planting a flag. My first stop was a grocery store, where I bought the basics, and a nursery, where I bought a small, hardy rose bush, the same variety Robert and I had planted in our first home together. I spent the afternoon clearing away the weeds in the cottage's small garden and planting the rows, my hands sinking into the cool, dark earth. It was a ritual of renewal, a promise to myself that something beautiful could still grow from this pain. A week passed. I didn't call. I didn't text again. I let the silence stretch, knowing it would be louder than any words I could say. I spent my days exploring the town, learning its rhythms. I found the library David used to mention, the park where I'd had that awful walk with Emily, the diner where the coffee was strong and the booths were worn comfortable. I became a familiar face, the polite, quiet woman who always tipped well and seemed to have all the time in the world. I was waiting, watching, praying for an opening. It came on a Tuesday morning. I was at the diner, reading a newspaper, when I saw David's car pull into the hardware store across the street. My heart leapt into my throat. This was it. A public place, neutral territory. I paid my bill, my hands trembling, and walked slowly across the street. I found him in the plumbing aisle looking lost and frustrated, holding a confusing tangle of pipe fittings. He looked so much like his father in that moment, all earnest confusion in the face of practical matters, that my breath hitched. "You need a 1/4-inch coupling, not a 3/8", I said softly, coming to stand beside him. He jumped, spinning around, his eyes wide with shock and something else, fear. "Mom, what are you doing here? I thought you were in Ohio." "I decided to stay for a while," I said, keeping my voice light, non-confrontational. I pointed to the correct part on the shelf. "That one there. Your father could never keep them straight either." I didn't try to hug him. I didn't mention Emily or Samuel. I just stood there, a calm, familiar presence in the midst of his domestic crisis. He stared at me, the confusion on his face deepening. "Where are you staying?" "I rented a little place on Maple Street, the one with the overgrown garden. I'm fixing it up." I smiled a little. "It's good to have a project." He just kept looking at me, the pipe fitting forgotten in his hand. I could see the wheels turning in his head, the panic warring with a flicker of something that looked like relief. He was so used to navigating Emily's emotional minefields that my simple, steady presence was disorienting him. "I should get this. The kitchen sink is leaking," he finally said, gesturing lamely with the part. "Of course," I said. "It was good to see you, David." I turned to leave, then paused, as if remembering something unimportant. "Oh, I found that silver rattle I told you about, the one my mother gave to you. I left it for you at the front counter. For Samuel." And with that, I walked away, my knees shaking, but my spirits soaring. I had done it. I had made contact. I had given him a gift from his own history, a tangible piece of our family line, and I had done it without demanding anything in return. I didn't look back. I got in my car and drove away, but I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the seed had been planted. The first fragile root had taken hold in the hard, frozen ground of their world. The wheat was far from over, but the stillness had been broken. I had thrown a stone into the pond, and now I had to wait for the ripples to reach the shore. The ripples from that day in the hardware store spread slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. David didn't call. He didn't show up at my cottage, but a week later, a simple text arrived. "The coupling worked. Thank you." It was nothing and everything. I wrote back, "Your father would be proud." And that was it. I continued my quiet life, tending my garden, becoming a regular at the diner, allowing myself to be a steady, unchanging point on their horizon. The war of attrition had begun, and my weapon was patience. Then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, my phone rang. It was David. His voice was strained, tight with an emotion I couldn't immediately place. "Mom, can you come over? It's Emily." My heart plummeted. Had something happened? Was it Samuel? "What's wrong?" I asked, already grabbing my car keys. There was a long pause, and I heard him take a shaky breath. She just told me to call you. She's in the nursery. She won't come out. The drive to their house was a blur of rain and fear. This wasn't the opening I had imagined. This felt like a crisis. I pulled into the driveway, my hands clenched on the wheel. I walked to the front door, and it opened before I could knock. David stood there, his face pale and ravaged by tears. "She's been crying for hours," he whispered. "She just keeps holding Samuel and saying she's failing him." I stepped inside, the familiar, sterile air feeling charged with a new, desperate energy. I walked upstairs, my footsteps silent on the carpet, and pushed open the nursery door. Emily was sitting in the rocking chair, Samuel asleep in her arms, but her body was racked with silent, shuddering sobs. She looked up as I entered, and there was no hatred in her eyes, only a bottomless, exhausted despair. "I can't do it," she choked out. "I can't be her. I can't be perfect. And he deserves a family that isn't broken." I knelt in front of her, my knees protesting, but I didn't care. I didn't touch her, I just looked at her. At this young woman drowning in a grief that was never hers to carry. "He doesn't need perfect, Emily," I said, my voice as soft as the rain against the window. "He just needs you, his mother, and he needs a father who isn't living in the past." It was as if my words unlocked a floodgate. The whole story tumbled out. Her constant, exhausting comparison to a ghost, her fear that every mistake was proof she was lacking, her terror that David's love for her was just a pale echo of what he'd lost. And as she spoke, David, who had been hovering in the doorway, came in and sank to the floor beside me, his own tears falling freely. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry I made you feel that way. I love you, Emily. It's different, but it's real. It's my choice." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a clarity I hadn't seen in years. "And Mom, I'm sorry I shut you out. I was ashamed. Ashamed that I couldn't just get over it, that I wasn't the strong son you raised." The three of us sat there on the nursery floor, surrounded by stuffed animals and the soft smell of baby, a tangled knot of pain and love finally beginning to loosen. I didn't offer easy answers. There were none. But I offered my presence, my witness. I told David that his grief would never be a disappointment, that it was a testament to his capacity to love, and that Robert and I had raised him to feel deeply, not to pretend. I told Emily that her strength wasn't in being perfect, but in building a life from the ashes, and that her son would learn resilience from her, not from some unattainable ideal. It wasn't a magic cure. The ghost of Elena would always be a part of their history, a tender scar. But that day, in the soft light of the nursery, we began the slow, careful work of building something new, not on a clean slate, but on the repaired foundation of the truth. I started visiting regularly, not as a guest, but as a grandmother, as a mother. I held Samuel while Emily napped. I showed David how to fix the leaky faucet himself. We even talked about Elena once, me asking what her laugh sounded like, David smiling through tears as he described it. It was a fragile piece, hard-won and precious. And as I sat on their porch swing months later, watching David push a laughing Samuel on a tricycle in the driveway, with Emily bringing me a glass of iced tea and resting her hand on my shoulder for a brief, warm moment, I knew that the story wasn't about forgiveness or winning anymore. It was about love, in all its messy, complicated, and enduring forms, finally finding a way to grow, even in the cracks.